In the year 2275, a human stood unflinching before the galaxy's most terrifying predator. George Griffin, Earth's diplomatic representative to the Galactic Council, found himself face to face with Cygnus, the infamous Devourer, an 8-foot-tall Hirogen female whose very presence paralyzed most sentient beings with fear. Yet George remained unaffected, his mind clear and his body responsive. This unprecedented encounter occurred during a routine security breach at the Galactic Council headquarters. As alarms blared and alien diplomats fled in panic, George turned a corner and collided with the towering form of Cygnus. Her razor-sharp claws glinted under the emergency lights, her predatory eyes locked onto George's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The collision was the culmination of a galaxy-wide crisis that had been unfolding for months. Cygnus had left a trail of destruction across multiple star systems, her unique biological trait allowing her to easily overpower and consume her victims. This ability, combined with her aggressive nature, had made her an outcast among her own kind and a terror to the rest of the galaxy. The Galactic Council had issued an unprecedented alert, warning all sentient species to avoid contact with Cygnus at all costs. Panic spread through the galaxy as reports of her attacks multiplied. Worlds fortified their defenses, trade routes were altered, and a palpable fear gripped the interstellar community. Humanity, still new to the galactic stage, found itself thrust into the spotlight due to George's immunity. The Galactic Council, desperate for a solution to the Cygnus problem, saw an opportunity in George's unique resistance. They quickly formulated a plan, tasking him with a perilous mission: to approach Cygnus and attempt communication, hoping to negotiate an end to her rampage. George's initial reluctance to accept such a dangerous assignment was overcome when he learned of the stakes involved. Earth's newly granted seat on the Galactic Council hung in the balance. The success or failure of this mission would determine humanity's standing in the galactic community for generations to come. As George prepared for his encounter with Cygnus, he delved into research about humanity's unique neurological structure. He discovered that this might be the key to their immunity against the Hirogen's fear-inducing ability. This revelation sparked intense interest from various alien factions, some of whom began to view humans as potential weapons against the Hirogen threat. Meanwhile, Cygnus, having caught wind of a human's immunity to her abilities, became intensely curious about George. She began stalking him from afar, studying his movements and behavior. Her predatory instincts were now focused on understanding this new and intriguing prey. As tensions rose and the galaxy watched with bated breath, George boarded a specially designed spacecraft. His mission: to make first contact with Cygnus in a neutral zone. The fate of humanity's galactic future rested on his shoulders as he prepared to face the most feared being in the known universe. Unknown to George, several alien factions had secretly planted tracking devices on his ship. Each had their own agenda regarding the outcome of this unprecedented meeting between human and Hirogen. As George's ship departed, carrying him towards his fateful encounter, the entire galaxy held its breath, waiting to see if this lone human could succeed where all others had failed. As George's spacecraft glided through the inky void towards the designated neutral zone, the silence aboard was palpable. His fingers drummed nervously on the control panel, eyes fixed on the screen that displayed nothing but distant stars. The weight of humanity's future pressed heavily on his shoulders. Suddenly, the communication panel lit up, its urgent beeping shattering the quiet. George's heart raced as he activated the transmission. The holographic image of Counselor Zrix, a tentacled Arcturian, flickered to life. "Griffin, abort the mission immediately!" Zrix's voice crackled with static and urgency. "Our long-range sensors have detected Cygnus approaching your position at unprecedented speed. Your safety is compromised. Return to base at once." George's mind raced, weighing the risks against the potential consequences of retreat. Earth's newly granted seat on the Galactic Council, the culmination of decades of diplomatic efforts, hung in the balance. He took a deep breath, steeling his willpower. "Negative, Counselor," George replied, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "The stakes are too high. I'm proceeding with the mission." Ignoring Zerix's protests, George cut the transmission and pushed forward into the neutral zone. The ship's sensors remained frustratingly silent, showing no sign of the approaching Hirogen. Without warning, the spacecraft shuddered violently. Alarms blared as systems across the board went dark. Emergency lights bathed the cockpit in an eerie red glow as backup power engaged. "Computer, status report," George barked, fingers flying over the controls. "Main power offline. Hull breach detected in aft section. Unknown entity has boarded the vessel," the AI's calm voice replied, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding. George's blood ran cold. He knew without a doubt that Cygnus had arrived. The airlock door behind him hissed open. George turned slowly, coming face to face with the most feared predator in the galaxy. Cygnus towered over him, her 8-foot frame filling the doorway. In the dim emergency lighting, her razor-sharp claws glinted menacingly. Her eyes, dark pools of primal hunger, locked onto George's. But where others would have been paralyzed with terror, George stood his ground. His unique neurological structure, the very reason he had been chosen for this mission, rendered him immune to the Hirogen's fear-inducing ability. Cygnus tilted her head, clearly puzzled by George's lack of terror. She began to circle him, her movements fluid and predatory. George remained still, calling upon years of diplomatic training to maintain his composure. "I am George Griffin, representative of Earth," he said, activating his universal translator. "I've come to speak with you, Cygnus." The Hirogen's response came as a series of guttural sounds. The translator crackled, struggling to interpret. "You not fear? How? Why here?" George seized the opportunity. "Humans are different," he explained, keeping his voice steady. "Our brains don't react to your ability the same way other species do. That's why I'm here. To talk. To understand." Cygnus stopped her circling, her piercing gaze fixed on George. The translator continued to interpret her growls and clicks. "Others always fear, always run, always fight. You, different. Interesting." As their conversation unfolded, George began to understand the true nature of Cygnus's destructive behavior. It wasn't born of malice, but of isolation and frustration. Her fearsome ability, while making her an apex predator, had also cut her off from all meaningful contact with other sentient beings. "It doesn't have to be this way," George said, an idea forming in his mind. "Come with me to Earth. There you can interact with humans without causing panic. We can work together to find a way for you to coexist peacefully with other species." Cygnus considered his words, her predatory features softening almost imperceptibly. For the first time in her long, lonely existence, she saw a glimmer of hope. Before she could respond, the ship rocked violently. Proximity alarms screamed to life as multiple vessels dropped out of faster-than-light travel, surrounding them. "Unidentified human vessel," a booming voice echoed through the comm system. "Surrender the Hirogen criminal and prepare to be boarded." George's mind raced. The alien factions that had tracked his ship had arrived, each with their own agenda. Some demanded Cygnus's capture. Others sought to seize both of them for study or weaponization. In that moment, George made a decision that would alter the course of galactic history. He lunged for the control panel, fingers flying over the emergency jump drive controls. "Hold on!" he shouted to Cygnus, as warnings blared about the dangers of unplotted faster-than-light travel. With a blinding flash and a stomach-lurching lurch, the ship vanished, leaving behind a cluster of bewildered alien vessels. The jump was unlike anything George had ever experienced. Reality itself seemed to twist and bend around them as they hurtled through space at impossible speeds. Beside him, Cygnus crouched low, her powerful form tense with the strain of the journey. When the jump drive finally disengaged, they found themselves drifting in an unknown sector of space. The ship's systems, overtaxed by the experimental jump, sparked and sputtered. As the main view screen flickered to life, George and Cygnus were greeted by the sight of an alien sky, filled with unfamiliar stars and swirling nebulae. They were lost, their ship damaged, in a part of the galaxy no human or Hirogen had ever seen. George turned to Cygnus, seeing his own mix of fear and excitement mirrored in her alien features. They were no longer predator and prey, diplomat and target. Here, in this uncharted expanse of space, they were reluctant partners, bound together by circumstance and the shared need to survive. As George began to assess the damage to the ship and their limited resources, he realized that this unexpected turn of events was just the beginning. The true challenge lay ahead, forging a partnership with Cygnus, finding their way back to known space, and potentially reshaping the galaxy's understanding of interspecies relations. With a deep breath, George turned to face the unknown, Cygnus at his side. Their journey was just beginning. The blinding flash of the emergency jump faded, revealing an alien sky filled with unfamiliar constellations. George's fingers danced across the control panel, desperately trying to stabilize the ship's failing systems. Beside him, Cygnus crouched low, her powerful form tense with the strain of their impossible journey. "Brace for impact!" George shouted as the ship shuddered violently, plummeting towards the surface of an unknown planet below. The hull groaned under the stress of atmospheric entry, heat building around them as they hurtled downward. With a bone-jarring crash, the ship slammed into the planet's surface, skidding across barren, sandy terrain before coming to a rest in a cloud of dust and debris. For a moment, all was silent save for the hiss of ruptured coolant lines and the settling of twisted metal. George groaned, pushing himself up from the sparking control panel. His head throbbed, and he tasted blood in his mouth. "Cygnus?" he called out, voice hoarse. A low growl answered him as the Hirogen emerged from the shadows of the ruined cockpit. Her eyes gleamed in the dim emergency lighting, assessing George for injuries. "Human. Alive," she rumbled through the translator. Wincing, George activated what remained of the ship's sensors. The data that flickered across the cracked screen painted a grim picture. They had crash-landed on a desert world with twin suns blazing in the sky, the harsh environment already taxing the ship's damaged life support systems. "We need to get out of here," George said, grabbing an emergency kit from beneath his seat. "The ship's unstable. It could go up in flames any minute." Together they forced open the warped airlock door and stepped out onto the alien world. Heat hit them like a physical force, the twin suns beating down mercilessly on the endless expanse of sand and rock. George squinted against the glare, surveying their surroundings. "We need shelter," he muttered, more to himself than to Cygnus. "And we need to salvage what we can from the ship before it's too late." Cygnus tilted her head, nostrils flaring as she scented the air. "No prey," she growled. "No water. Bad place." "You're right about that," George agreed, wiping sweat from his brow. "But we don't have a choice. We're stuck here until we can repair the ship or signal for help." Over the next few hours, they worked tirelessly to create a makeshift shelter using debris from the crash. George's diplomatic skills were put to the test as he guided Cygnus's raw strength, channeling her predatory instincts into constructive efforts. By the time the first sun began to set, they had cobbled together a crude but functional base camp. As the temperature dropped with alarming speed, George huddled in their shelter, tinkering with the ship's salvage communication system. Cygnus paced restlessly outside, her eyes gleaming in the darkness as she kept watch for potential threats. Days passed, blending into a grueling routine of survival and repair work. George divided his time between trying to fix the ship's systems and scavenging for resources. Cygnus, with her superior strength and heightened senses, took on the role of protector and hunter, though the barren planet offered little in the way of prey. During the long, cold nights, George found himself talking more and more with Cygnus. At first, their conversations were purely practical, focused on survival. But as time wore on, they began to share stories of their respective cultures and experiences. "Tell more about Earth," Cygnus requested one evening, as they huddled around a small fire fueled by salvaged materials. George smiled, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his face. "Well, Earth is nothing like this place. We have vast oceans, towering mountains, dense forests." He paused, a pang of homesickness hitting him unexpectedly. "And billions of humans, all living together in cities and towns." Cygnus listened intently, her alien features softening with curiosity. Humans not fear each other? Oh, we do sometimes, George chuckled. But not in the way other species fear you. We've learned to live together, to cooperate. It's not always easy, but it's how we've survived and thrived. As George spoke about human emotions and relationships, he noticed a change in Cygnus. The fearsome predator seemed almost wistful, her usual aggressive demeanor giving way to something more contemplative. In turn, Cygnus shared her knowledge of galactic wildlife and survival techniques. George listened in fascination as she described the hunting patterns of various alien species and the intricacies of interstellar ecosystems. He realized that there was far more to the Hirogen than their fearsome reputation suggested. Their routine was shattered one day by a massive sandstorm that forced them to abandon their camp. Blinded by swirling sand and buffeted by fierce winds, they stumbled through the desert, Cygnus's powerful form shielding George from the worst of the storm. Just as George felt his strength failing, Cygnus's clawed hand closed around his arm. "Here," she growled over the howling wind. "Opening." George squinted through the haze of sand and saw a dark crevice in a rock face. Together, they squeezed through the narrow opening, finding themselves in a vast underground cave system. As the storm raged outside, they explored deeper into the caves. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and covered in strange glowing symbols. "This isn't natural," George murmured, running his hand along the wall. These caves were made by someone. Their path led them to a massive chamber, filled with what could only be described as alien technology. Sleek, otherworldly machines lined the walls, their purpose a mystery. George's eyes widened as he recognized components similar to those in their damaged ship. "This could be our way out of here," he breathed, excitement building in his chest. As George moved towards one of the machines, a high-pitched whine filled the air. The floor beneath him began to shift, panels sliding away to reveal a glowing grid of energy. "George!" Cygnus roared, her powerful legs propelling her forward with inhuman speed. She tackled him, both of them rolling across the floor as beams of energy lanced through the space where George had been standing moments before. Heart pounding, George looked up at Cygnus, her massive form crouched protectively over him. You saved me?" he gasped. Cygnus's eyes locked with his, an unspoken understanding passing between them. In that moment, George realized that their relationship had fundamentally changed. They were no longer reluctant allies thrown together by circumstance, but partners who trusted each other with their lives. As the alien defense system powered down, they carefully made their way through the chamber, salvaging what they could. With Cygnus's strength and George's technical knowledge, they gathered crucial components that could potentially repair their ship. Returning to their camp, George threw himself into the repair work with renewed vigor. Cygnus assisted as best she could, her dexterous claws proving surprisingly useful for delicate mechanical work. After days of nonstop effort, George finally managed to restore partial power to the ship. The familiar hum of systems coming online filled him with hope. But as he ran a full diagnostic, his heart sank. "What wrong?" Cygnus asked, sensing his distress. George turned to her, his expression grave. "The life support system. It's damaged beyond what I can fully repair with what we have here. It can only sustain one of us for the journey back to known space." The implications of this revelation hung heavily between them. They had come so far, forged an unlikely bond in the crucible of survival. Now they faced an impossible choice. Cygnus's eyes narrowed, her posture shifting as she processed this new information. George tensed, wondering if the Hirogen's predatory instincts would resurface in the face of this threat to her survival. But Cygnus surprised him once again. "We find way," she growled, persistence evident in her voice. "Together." George nodded, a mix of relief and admiration washing over him. "Together," he agreed, turning back to the ship's systems with revitalized commitment. They had overcome every obstacle this harsh world had thrown at them. Somehow, they would find a way to overcome this one too. As George worked tirelessly to improve the life support system, neither of them could have predicted the challenges that still lay ahead. Challenges that would test not only their survival skills, but the very nature of their newfound partnership. Partnership, but the depths of their capacity for understanding and cooperation. As they worked to improve the life support system, George felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew they were on the cusp of a breakthrough, not just in their survival, but in the very nature of human-hydrogen relations. Suddenly, the ship's sensors blared to life, startling them both. George's eyes widened as he took in the information scrolling across the screen. "Cygnus, we've got a problem. There's a massive asteroid field ahead, and our damaged sensors didn't pick it up until now." Cygnus moved to the view screen, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. The field stretched before them, a chaotic dance of rocks and debris that threatened to tear their fragile ship apart. "No time to plot a course," George said, his hands hovering over the controls. "We'll have to navigate manually." Without hesitation, Cygnus stepped forward, her powerful form settling into the co-pilot's seat. "I guide, you fly," she growled, her eyes locked on the approaching field. George nodded, understanding immediately. Cygnus's superior reflexes and spatial awareness would be their best chance at survival. He took a deep breath and gripped the controls, ready to follow her lead. As they entered the field, time seemed to slow. Cygnus's voice became a constant, steady stream of instructions. "Left, right, up, dive." George responded instantly, his hands moving in perfect synchronization with her words. Asteroids hurtled past them, some so close they could hear the scrape of rock against the ship's hull. Sweat beaded on George's forehead as he pushed the damaged ship to its limits, corkscrewing and weaving through the deadly obstacle course. In those intense moments, their connection deepened. They weren't just two individuals working together. They became a single unit, their minds and bodies in perfect harmony. The gap between human and hydrogen seemed to vanish, leaving only two beings united in their fight for survival. As they emerged from the other side of the field, George let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned to Cygnus, a smile of relief and admiration on his face. "We did it," he said softly. Cygnus met his gaze, and George saw something new in her alien eyes, a warmth he'd never noticed before. "We strong, together," she rumbled. Their moment of triumph was short-lived. A high-pitched beep from the communication console caught their attention. George frowned as he examined the incoming signal. "It's a distress call," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "From a nearby planet." Cygnus tilted her head, her posture tensing. "Trap?" she asked, her natural caution asserting itself. George hesitated. Investigating the signal could lead them into danger, possibly even detection by those pursuing them. But he couldn't ignore the possibility that someone needed help. "We have to check it out," he decided. "If it were us sending that signal, we'd want someone to respond." Cygnus nodded, accepting his decision without argument. It was a testament to how far they'd come that she trusted his judgment implicitly. As they approached the planet, George's eyes widened in disbelief. The sensors showed clear signs of human habitation. "It's a colony," he breathed, "a human colony out here in uncharted space." They landed on the outskirts of a settlement, the buildings a mixture of prefab structures and more permanent constructions. As the airlock hissed open, George and Cygnus were met by a group of armed colonists, their faces a mix of wariness and curiosity. A tall man with graying hair stepped forward, his posture radiating authority. "I'm Commander Marcus Stern," he said, his eyes darting between George and Cygnus. "Who are you, and how did you find us?" George raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm George Larson, a human diplomat. This is Cygnus, my partner." He hesitated only slightly over the word. "We picked up your distress signal. We're here to help, if we can." Stern's eyebrows rose at the sight of Cygnus, but to his credit, he didn't react with outright hostility. A human and a hydrogen working together? That's unexpected. As George explained their situation, leaving out certain sensitive details, he could see the colonists' expressions changing. Their initial fear of Cygnus gave way to amazement as they observed her non-threatening behavior towards George. Stern listened intently, his face growing more troubled as George spoke. When George finished, the commander sighed heavily. "We've been cut off from Earth for decades," he explained. "Our long-range communication array malfunctioned years ago, and we haven't been able to repair it. We've been completely isolated." George's mind raced with the implications. A human colony, lost and forgotten in uncharted space. The diplomatic ramifications alone were staggering. "We might be able to help with your communications array," he offered. "In exchange, we could use a safe haven while we plan our next move. And perhaps some supplies?" Stern nodded slowly, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "That seems fair. But I warn you, not everyone here will be as accepting of your companion as I am. There are those who fear anything alien." As if on cue, a commotion broke out among the gathered colonists. A man with a scarred face pushed his way to the front, his eyes blazing with anger and fear. "We can't trust them," he shouted, "especially not that creature." George tensed, recognizing the dangerous situation unfolding. He stepped forward, placing himself between Cygnus and the agitated colonists. It was time to put his diplomatic skills to the ultimate test, bridging the gap not just between two individuals, but between two species whose history was marked by fear and conflict. As the sun began to set on this alien world, casting long shadows across the colony, George knew that the challenges ahead would test not only his abilities as a diplomat, but the very foundations of human-alien relations. The next few days would be crucial, not just for their survival, but for the future of interspecies cooperation in the galaxy. The tense standoff between George, Cygnus, and the suspicious colonists was abruptly interrupted by the colony's alarm system blaring to life. Commander Stern's eyes widened as he glanced at a nearby display panel. "Multiple ships entering the atmosphere," he announced, his voice tight with concern. "Unknown configurations, but they're not ours." George's heart raced as he realized the gravity of the situation. Their pursuers had finally caught up with them. He exchanged a quick glance with Cygnus, seeing his own commitment mirrored in her alien eyes. "Commander," George said, turning to Stern, "we need to activate your defensive systems immediately. Do you have any shield generators?" Stern nodded grimly. "We do, but they're outdated. We haven't had to use them in years." "It's better than nothing," George replied. "Cygnus and I will help you prepare for the incoming threat." As they rushed to the colony's control center, George could hear the distant roar of ship engines growing louder. The colonists scrambled around them, a mix of fear and confusion evident on their faces. Inside the control room, Stern's fingers flew over the console, bringing the ancient shield generators online. A faint shimmer appeared in the sky above the colony as the protective barrier flickered into existence. George activated the communication systems, hoping to open a dialogue with the approaching ships. "This is George Larson, representing the colony. We request peaceful communication. Please state your intentions." The response came quickly, a cacophony of voices from various faction leaders. Their demands were clear and chilling: surrender George and Cygnus immediately, or face destruction. As George attempted to negotiate, explaining the potential for peaceful coexistence, he could see the faction ships forming an offensive pattern around the colony. His words fell on deaf ears as the alien leaders and human separatists refused to listen, their minds set on capturing the unlikely human-hydrogen pair. Suddenly, the shield protecting the colony flickered and died. Alarms blared throughout the control room as Stern frantically tried to diagnose the problem. "The generators have been sabotaged," Stern shouted, his face pale with shock. Before they could react, a barrage of energy weapons rained down on the defenseless settlement. The ground shook, and the air filled with the sound of explosions and screaming colonists. Cygnus sprang into action, her Hirogen combat instincts taking over. "I organize defense," she growled, her eyes scanning the tactical displays. "George, help Stern with evacuation." As Cygnus rushed out to coordinate the ground forces, George turned to Stern. "We need to get the non-combatants to safety. Do you have any secure shelters?" Stern nodded, already pulling up a colony map. "There's a network of underground bunkers. We can direct people there through the emergency broadcast system." As they worked to coordinate the evacuation, George couldn't help but marvel at Cygnus's leadership. Through the control room's windows, he could see her organizing the colonists into defensive positions. her powerful form moving with purpose and precision. The battle raged on, with Cygnus and her makeshift militia managing to hold off the initial wave of ground forces. But George knew they couldn't last long against the superior firepower of the faction ships. As he helped Stern guide another group of civilians to safety, George noticed a strange anomaly on the colony map. "What's this area here?" he asked, pointing to an unmarked section. Stern frowned. "I'm not sure. That section of the colony was here when we arrived. We assumed it was part of the original settlement, but we've never managed to access it." Intrigued, George made his way to the mysterious area, guided by a hunch. As he approached, he noticed a subtle difference in the construction, a level of sophistication beyond the rest of the colony. His fingers brushed against a hidden panel, and suddenly a door slid open, revealing a high-tech bunker filled with advanced weaponry and technology. George's eyes widened as he took in the sight, his mind racing with the implications. "Commander," he called into his communicator, "I've found something that might turn the tide of this battle." As Stern joined him, they quickly formulated a plan. George activated the bunker's systems, revealing a powerful energy weapon capable of disabling multiple ships at once. Outside, Cygnus led a daring counterattack against the landed faction forces. Her combat prowess and the element of surprise allowed her team to disable several enemy ships, buying crucial time for George and Stern. With a deep breath, George aimed the energy weapon at the faction ships still in the air. He fired, watching in awe as beams of energy lanced out, enveloping the hostile vessels. One by one, their weapons and propulsion systems went dark, leaving them drifting helplessly in the sky. The sudden silence that fell over the battlefield was deafening. George seized the moment, opening a channel to the faction leaders. "Your attack has failed," he announced, his voice firm. "But I'm offering you a chance to listen to what we have to say. What we've discovered here goes beyond our conflict. It involves a conspiracy that affects us all." As the faction leaders reluctantly agreed to hear him out, George knew that this was just the beginning. The battle for the colony might be over, but the real challenge, forging a new path for human-alien relations, was only just beginning. The battle for the colony might be over, but the real challenge, forging a new path for human-alien relations, was only just starting. In the weeks that followed, George and Cygnus found themselves thrust into the role of ambassadors for the colony. Their unique partnership had become a symbol of hope for a future where humans and aliens could coexist peacefully. As they worked tirelessly to establish diplomatic ties and secure the colony's place in the galaxy, their bond deepened. One evening, as they sat on the roof of their shared dwelling, watching the alien sunset paint the sky in hues of purple and green, George turned to Cygnus. "We've come so far," he said softly. "I never imagined I'd find a partner like you." Cygnus rumbled in agreement, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "We strong together," she said. "But want more." George raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Cygnus struggled to find the words, her limited grasp of human language failing her. Finally, she placed a hand on her abdomen. "Family," she said simply. George's eyes widened as he understood her meaning. The idea of starting a family with Cygnus had never occurred to him, but now that she'd voiced it, he found himself filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "Are you sure that's even possible?" he asked. The next day, they sought out Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the colony's leading xenobiologist. Her lab was a cluttered space filled with equipment George couldn't begin to identify. As they explained their situation, Dr. Rodriguez's eyes lit up with scientific curiosity. "Interspecies reproduction between humans and hydrogen? It's never been attempted before," she mused, already pulling up holographic displays of human and hydrogen DNA. "But it's not outside the realm of possibility. Cygnus's species has remarkable adaptive capabilities." Over the following weeks, George and Cygnus underwent a battery of tests. Dr. Rodriguez analyzed their genetic compatibility, studied Cygnus's unique biology, and explored potential methods of conception. The process was exhausting, but the couple remained hopeful. Meanwhile, their diplomatic duties continued. George organized a summit on the colony, inviting representatives from Earth, the Galactic Council, and various alien factions. The goal was to discuss the formation of an independent coalition and address concerns about interspecies relations. As delegates from across the galaxy arrived, tension filled the air. The colony's main conference center buzzed with a cacophony of languages and the rustle of diverse anatomies. George stood at the podium, preparing to open the proceedings, when he noticed Ambassador Jonathan Graves from Earth, whispering heatedly with his aides. As George began his welcome speech, Graves interrupted, his face flushed with anger. "We cannot allow this farce to continue," he shouted. "The very idea of human-alien hybrids is an abomination. It will dilute our genetic purity and pose unforeseen risks to both species." The conference erupted into chaos. Delegates shouted over each other, some agreeing with Graves, others vehemently opposing him. George tried to restore order, but his voice was lost in the din. Suddenly, Cygnus strode to the podium. Her imposing presence silenced the room. She began to speak, her words careful and measured. "I am Hirogen," she said. "Once I hunt humans. Now I love human. I see strength and difference. Together, we are more than alone." As she continued, sharing her experiences with George and the colonists, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Even those who had been hostile began to listen. George watched in awe as Cygnus's simple, heartfelt words accomplished what his careful diplomacy could not. The summit concluded with a tentative agreement to form a committee to study the potential impacts and benefits of interspecies relationships. It wasn't everything George had hoped for, but it was a start. As the delegates departed, George and Cygnus received an urgent message from Dr. Rodriguez. They rushed to her lab, hearts pounding with anticipation. "I have good news," Dr. Rodriguez announced, her eyes shining with excitement. "With some genetic modifications and medical interventions, it might be possible for you to conceive a child." George and Cygnus exchanged a look of joy and trepidation. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with potential risks and challenges. But before they could discuss it further, Commander Stern burst into the lab, his face grave. "We've detected a massive fleet approaching from deep space," he announced. "Origin unknown, but the size suggests a potential invasion force." George felt his heart sink. He looked at Cygnus, seeing his own mix of emotions reflected in her eyes. Their dream of starting a family would have to wait. Once again, they were called to defend not just their home, but their vision for a future of interspecies harmony. As they left the lab to prepare for the coming threat, George took Cygnus's hand in his. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The mysterious fleet loomed on the horizon, a reminder that their fight for peace and understanding was far from finished. George and Cygnus stood side by side on the colony's observation deck, watching as the mysterious fleet materialized from the depths of space. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Hundreds of ships of various sizes and designs, their hulls bearing the scars of long-distance travel. "Incoming transmission," announced the communications officer, her voice tight with tension. George nodded, steeling himself. "Put it through." The view screen flickered to life, revealing a gaunt reptilian face with large pleading eyes. "This is Captain Zarlek of the refugee fleet. We come seeking asylum and protection. Our worlds have fallen to the Zarkoth Dominion, an empire of unprecedented cruelty and aggression." George exchanged a glance with Cygnus, whose eyes narrowed in concentration. He turned back to the screen. "Captain Zarlek, this is George Larson. We're activating our defense systems as a precaution. Please maintain your current position while we discuss your request." The next hours were a whirlwind of activity. George convened an emergency meeting with Commander Stern, Cygnus, and key representatives from their allied species. The debate was heated, with valid concerns raised about resource strain and the potential threat of drawing the Zarkoth Dominion's attention. Cygnus, usually reserved in such meetings, spoke up. "We strong together," she said, her words careful but firm. "Turn away, we weak. Accept, we grow." Her simple statement cut through the arguing, reminding everyone of the principles that had brought them together. George felt a surge of pride and affection for his partner. "Cygnus is right," he said. "We can't abandon these people. Prepare for emergency landing protocols." As the refugee ships descended, the colony sprang into action. Temporary shelters were erected, medical triage centers established, and food distribution points set up. George marveled at the efficiency of their diverse team. Hydrogen's strength combined with human ingenuity, supported by the unique abilities of their various alien allies. Amidst the controlled chaos, George noticed Cygnus approach a group of new arrivals. Her massive form towered over the exhausted refugees, but her movements were gentle as she guided them toward the medical center. He smiled, struck once again by the depth of her compassion. Their moment of connection was interrupted by Commander Stern's urgent voice. "George, we've got a situation. One of the refugees, she's Zarkoth." George's heart raced as he followed Stern to a secluded area of the landing zone. There, surrounded by a ring of wary security personnel, stood a tall, sleek figure with iridescent scales and piercing silver eyes. Her swollen abdomen marked her as pregnant. "I am Vexara," she said, her voice melodic despite the underlying tension. "Former scientist of the Zarkoth Dominion, I seek sanctuary not just for myself, but for the future of my people." George studied her, noting the fear and perseverance in her eyes. He made a decision. "Lower your weapons," he ordered the security team. "Vexara, we have a lot to discuss." Over the next few days, as the colony absorbed the influx of refugees, Vexara proved to be an invaluable source of information. She provided detailed schematics of Zarkoth technology and insights into their military strategy. "Their primary weapon is a plasma cannon of unparalleled power," she explained during a strategy session, "but it has a critical weakness in its cooling system." This information galvanized the colony's scientists and engineers. They worked tirelessly to adapt the advanced weaponry from the hidden bunker, incorporating Vexara's insights and the expertise of other refugee scientists. As George coordinated these efforts, Cygnus took charge of preparing the colony's defenses. She organized mixed-species combat units, leveraging the unique abilities of each race. The sight of a Hirogen warrior training alongside a human marine and a four-armed Zelbian sniper became a common one. One evening, exhausted from the day's preparations, George found Cygnus in Dr. Rodriguez's lab. The doctor was explaining the latest developments in their reproductive research, her eyes bright with excitement. "The addition of Zarkoth genetic mapping techniques has accelerated our progress significantly," Dr. Rodriguez said. "We're closer than ever to making this possible for you two." George felt a mix of hope and anxiety. He took Cygnus's hand, feeling the strength in her grip. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "we're in this together." Their moment of peace was shattered by a blaring alarm. Commander Stern's voice came over the intercom, tight with urgency. "Long-range sensors have detected a Zarkoth warfleet entering the system. All personnel to battle stations." As they raced to the command center, George's mind whirled with the enormity of what they faced. The colony's defenses were stronger than ever, but would it be enough? He thought of the refugees they'd sworn to protect, of the fragile alliance they'd built, of the future he and Cygnus hoped to create. The command center was a hive of activity. Holographic displays showed the approaching Zarkoth fleet, a mass of sleek, predatory ships that dwarfed their own forces. "Prototype shield is ready," reported the chief engineer, "but the power requirements are off the charts. If it fails, we'll be defenseless." George looked at Cygnus, seeing his own mix of purpose and fear reflected in her eyes. They stood at the precipice of a battle that would determine not just their fate, but the future of interspecies cooperation in the galaxy. As the first Zarkoth ships entered firing range, George gave the order to activate the shield. The air crackled with energy as the protective barrier sprang to life. On the interface, the lead Zarkoth vessel unleashed a blinding stream of plasma. The shield held, barely, but as alarms blared and power readings fluctuated wildly, George knew this was only the beginning. The true test of their united coalition lay ahead, and the outcome would reshape the future of the galaxy. Galaxy. The impact sent shockwaves through the command center, knocking several officers off their feet. George gripped the edge of the tactical display, his fist clenched as he watched the energy readings fluctuate wildly. "Shield integrity at 78% and dropping," reported the chief engineer, her voice strained. "We can't take many more hits like that." George's mind raced, analyzing their options. The prototype shield was holding, but for how long? He glanced at Cygnus, who stood tall and resolute beside him, her eyes fixed on the holographic battle display. "Cygnus," he said, his voice low and urgent, "we need to coordinate our ground forces. If the shield fails—" She nodded, understanding immediately. Without a word, she strode from the command center, her powerful frame radiating purpose and grit. As if on cue, the tactical display lit up with new alerts. Commander Stern's voice cut through the chaos. "Multiple enemy signatures detected. They're launching swarms of smaller craft." George watched in growing alarm as hundreds of Zarkoth attack ships poured from the larger vessels, forming a deadly cloud that descended towards the colony. Their strategy was clear: overwhelm the shield through sheer numbers. "All defense squadrons, engage!" George ordered, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his gut. "Prioritize protecting the shield generators." The view screens came alive with the chaos of battle. The colony's mixed-species defense force rose to meet the Zarkoth swarm. Human pilots flew alongside four-armed Zelbian gunners, while Hirogen warriors manned heavy assault craft. The diversity of their force, once seen as a weakness by some, now proved to be their greatest strength. George watched with a mixture of pride and fear as their fighters engaged the enemy. The Zarkoth's standardized tactics faltered in the face of the colonists' unpredictable maneuvers and varied abilities. A human pilot's daring barrel roll allowed a Zelbian gunner to take out 3 enemy ships in rapid succession. A Hirogen-piloted assault craft plowed through a squadron of Zarkoth fighters, its reinforced hull shrugging off their attacks. But the Zarkoth numbers were overwhelming. Despite the colonists' valiant efforts, enemy ships began to slip through their defenses. Alarms blared as the first explosions rocked the colony's outer buildings. "Perimeter breach in sectors 7 through 9, reported a harried officer. "Enemy ground forces incoming." George's hand flew to his communicator. "Cygnus, we have multiple breaches. Enemy forces are—" "I see them," Cygnus's voice crackled through the speaker, punctuated by the sounds of weapons fire. "We engage now." On one of the secondary screens, George caught glimpses of the ground battle. Cygnus led from the front, her massive form a rallying point for the defenders. Her Hirogen combat skills, honed over a lifetime of hunting, made her a terror in close-quarters fighting. She moved with fluid grace, each strike precise and devastatingly effective against the Zarkoth soldiers. But it was more than just her individual prowess that turned the tide. Cygnus coordinated the diverse defenders with remarkable skill, positioning each species where their unique abilities would be most effective. Human Marines provided covering fire, while Zelbian scouts used their agility to outflank the enemy. A group of refugee scientists, led by Vexara, provided real-time intelligence on Zarkoth weak points and tactics. For a moment, George allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope, but that hope was quickly dashed as new alarms blared throughout the command center. "Shield power at critical levels," the chief engineer shouted, her voice edged with panic. "We're looking at total failure in less than 10 minutes. George's mind raced. They couldn't survive without the shield, but maintaining it would drain their power reserves completely, leaving them defenseless. He needed to make a decision, and fast. "Commander Stern, gather our top strategists and the refugee scientists. We need options, now." As the impromptu war council convened, ideas flew back and forth. Traditional tactics were discarded as quickly as they were proposed. Then a refugee Zelbian engineer spoke up, her forearms gesticulating excitedly. "What if we lower the shield intentionally, just for a moment? We could use the power surge to launch a surprise attack." The room fell silent as the implication sank in. It was audacious, perhaps even reckless, but it might be their only chance. George nodded, his decision made. "Prepare our fastest ships. We'll lower the shield for exactly 30 seconds. That's our window to strike." As the plan was set in motion, George opened a channel to all colonial forces. "Attention all defenders. We're about to execute a high-risk maneuver. When the shield drops, expect heavy fire. Hold your positions at all costs. This is our chance to turn the tide." He took a deep breath, watching the countdown on the main display. As it reached 0, he gave the order. "Lower the shield. Launch attack squadron." The massive energy barrier flickered and died. For a heartbeat, the colony lay exposed. Then, as if from nowhere, a squadron of Allied ships burst from hiding places around the planet. Led by the skilled Captain Rax, they tore into the surprised Zarkoth fleet. The command center erupted in cheers as the view screens showed Zarkoth ships exploding under the sudden assault. But their jubilation was short-lived. The Zarkoth, though caught off guard, quickly regrouped. Their return fire was devastating. "Raise the shield!" George ordered, his voice hoarse. The energy barrier flickered back to life, but not before several Zarkoth shots found their mark. The colony shuddered under the impact. As damage reports flooded in, the door to the command center burst open. Dr. Rodriguez rushed in, her lab coat askew and her eyes wide with excitement. "George," she gasped out of breath. "I need to speak with you. It's about Cygnus. Something incredible has happened." George's heart raced, torn between the immediate crisis and his concern for Cygnus. As Dr. Rodriguez began to explain, the tactical display lit up with new warnings. The Zarkoth were intensifying their assault, and the colony's future hung in the balance. Balance. George's mind raced, torn between the immediate crisis and his concern for Cygnus. But before Dr. Rodriguez could elaborate, the tactical display lit up with a new, terrifying alert. "Zarkoth flagship breaking formation," Commander Stern shouted. "It's on a direct collision course with the colony." George's blood ran cold as he realized the Zarkoth's bold strategy. With their shields failing and their forces overwhelmed, the enemy had chosen a final, devastating strike. In that moment of crisis, George's eyes fell on a small, inconspicuous panel near the command console. It was the access point to the hidden bunker's most closely guarded secret, an experimental gravity manipulation device. The weapon had been deemed too unstable for use, but now it represented their last hope. "Prepare a strike team," George ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We're going to bring the fight to them." As the team assembled, George briefed them on the audacious plan. They would use a small, agile ship to approach the Zarkoth flagship and deploy the gravity device at close range. It was a suicide mission by any reasonable standard, but these were not reasonable times. George was the first aboard the ship, followed closely by Cygnus, who had just returned from the ground battle. Her fur was singed and she bore fresh wounds, but her eyes burned with grit. "I will pilot," she said, her voice brooking no argument. George nodded, knowing her enhanced skills would give them the best chance of success. As they launched from the colony, the view screen showed the full might of the Zarkoth fleet bearing down on them. The remaining colonial forces rallied, providing covering fire and drawing attention away from the small strike team. Cygnus's piloting was nothing short of miraculous. She wove through the storm of enemy fire, her movements fluid and precise. George marveled at her skill, even as he braced himself against the ship's violent maneuvers. "Approaching optimal range," one of the team members called out. George's hands hovered over the gravity device's controls, sweat beading on his forehead. Suddenly, a barrage of Zarkoth fire rocked their ship. Alarms blared as systems failed, and for a heart-stopping moment, George thought they'd been defeated. But Cygnus, with inhuman reflexes, compensated for the damage and kept them on course. "Now, George," she roared. George activated the device. The effect was immediate and terrifying. A localized gravitational field sprang into existence around the Zarkoth flagship, its immense bulk suddenly sluggish and unresponsive. But the victory was short-lived. The gravitational field began to expand rapidly, threatening to engulf nearby Allied ships. George watched in horror as the readings spiked beyond anything the scientists had predicted. "We have to shut it down," a team member urged, panic evident in their voice. George's mind raced. Shutting down now would save their allies, but leave the Zarkoth threat intact. Increasing power might neutralize the enemy completely, but at the cost of their own forces. In a flash of inspiration, George's fingers flew over the controls. He reprogrammed the device on the fly, splitting its output into multiple, smaller fields. Each one targeted a critical system on the Zarkoth flagship. The effect was dramatic. The massive ship's propulsion systems failed in rapid succession. Weapon emplacements went dark. The flagship, once an unstoppable juggernaut, now drifted helplessly in space. "All ships, press the attack," George commanded over the comms. The Allied fleet, led by the indomitable Captain Rax, surged forward. With their flagship neutralized, the remaining Zarkoth vessels fell into disarray. As the tide of battle turned decisively in their favor, George's communicator crackled to life. Dr. Rodriguez's voice came through, tight with urgency and excitement. "George, you need to bring Cygnus in immediately. The gravitational fields, they've had an unprecedented effect on her physiology." Heart pounding, George ordered an immediate return to the colony. As they docked, medical teams swarmed the ship. Cygnus, looking dazed but otherwise unharmed, was whisked away to the medical bay. George paced outside as Dr. Rodriguez ran her tests, his mind whirling with possibilities and fears. When the doctor finally emerged, her face was split by an incredulous smile. "It's remarkable," she breathed. "The extreme gravitational forces have accelerated Cygnus's adaptive biology far beyond our previous estimates. Her reproductive system, George, it's compatible with humans now. You two could conceive naturally." The news hit George like a physical force. He stumbled, steadying himself against the wall as the implications washed over him. Through the window of the medical bay, he locked eyes with Cygnus. In that moment, amid the chaos of the battle's aftermath, a future they had scarcely dared to hope for suddenly seemed within reach. But even as joy bloomed in his chest, George knew their challenges were just getting started. The colony was battered, filled with refugees and former enemies. The Galactic Council would undoubtedly take notice of their victory, bringing new scrutiny and political complexities. And now, the prospect of a child, a union of human and hydrogen, unprecedented in galactic history, added a new dimension to their responsibilities. As if sensing his thoughts, Cygnus emerged from the medical bay. She took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "Whatever comes next," she said, her voice low and determined, "we face it together." George nodded, squeezing her hand in return. They turned toward the command center, where reports of the battle's conclusion were already pouring in. The future was uncertain, filled with promise and peril in equal measure. But for now, they had a colony to rebuild, a victory to secure, and a hope for the future that burned brighter than ever before. As the dust settled from the Zarkoth battle, George and Cygnus found themselves at the center of a rapidly evolving colony. The victory had not only secured their survival, but also ushered in a new era of interspecies cooperation. The diverse inhabitants, once divided by fear and mistrust, now worked side by side to rebuild and expand their home. In the months that followed, the colony buzzed with activity. Humans collaborated with Zelbians on advanced engineering projects, while hydrogen hunters shared their expertise in planetary defense systems. The refugee scientists, led by Vexara, established a cutting-edge research facility dedicated to solving the unique challenges of their multi-species society. Amid this flurry of progress, George and Cygnus prepared for a more personal adventure: parenthood. Dr. Rodriguez's revelation about their newfound compatibility had opened a door they never thought possible. As Cygnus's pregnancy progressed, their impending child became a symbol of hope for the entire colony. 9 months after the battle, alarms blared through the medical bay. Dr. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the intercom. "All medical personnel report to Delivery Room 1. This is not a drill." George raced through the corridors, his heart pounding. He burst into the delivery room to find Cygnus already there, her face contorted in pain, but her eyes blazing with willpower. "You're just in time," Dr. Rodriguez said, her calm demeanor belying the historic nature of the moment. Around her, a team of human and alien medical experts readied their equipment, each chosen for their unique expertise in this unprecedented delivery. Hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos. George held Cygnus's hand, marveling at her strength as she endured labor that would have broken a lesser being. The medical team worked in perfect synchronization, adapting their procedures on the fly to accommodate Cygnus's unique physiology. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a new sound filled the room, the cry of a newborn. Dr. Rodriguez held up the child, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's a girl," she announced, her voice thick with emotion. As the baby was placed in Cygnus's arms, George leaned in close, taking in every detail of their daughter's face. She had his eyes, bright and curious, set in a face that bore the distinctive markings of her Hieragen heritage. "Aurora," Cygnus whispered, her voice rough from exertion. "Her name is Aurora." The news of Aurora's birth spread across the colony faster than a Zelbian scout could run. Within hours, it had reached the far corners of the galaxy. The first confirmed human-Hieragen hybrid was more than just a medical miracle. She was a living testament to the potential of interspecies harmony. As Aurora grew, she quickly became the darling of the colony. Her first steps were celebrated by humans and aliens alike, each milestone a shared victory for their fledgling society. But with her unique heritage came unique challenges. George found himself poring over data pads late into the night, researching the perfect balance of nutrients for Aurora's hybrid physiology. Cygnus spent hours in the training grounds, adapting Hieragen techniques to suit their daughter's developing abilities. When Aurora was 3, she solved a complex puzzle designed for adult Zelbians in mere minutes. At 4, she outran the colony's fastest human sprinter. Each new ability brought pride and concern in equal measure. "We always knew she'd be special," George said one evening, watching Aurora effortlessly scale a wall that would challenge most adult humans. Cygnus nodded, her eyes never leaving their daughter. "Special comes with its own dangers. We must prepare her for a galaxy that may not understand her." Their concerns were justified. As word of Aurora's abilities spread, the colony experienced an influx of visitors. Some came out of genuine curiosity or hope, like the interspecies couples seeking advice and support. Others arrived with more dubious intentions, from overzealous scientists to political opportunists. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session to discuss the implications of Aurora's existence. Debates raged across 1,000 worlds about the ethics and potential consequences of interspecies breeding. Amidst this storm of galactic attention, a new challenge emerged. The Hieragen High Council, intrigued by reports of Aurora's abilities, dispatched a delegation to the colony. Their arrival sent ripples of tension through the community, many remembering the Hieragen's fearsome reputation. George and Cygnus stood side by side as the Hieragen ship docked, Aurora between them. The delegation emerged, their imposing figures casting long shadows in the afternoon sun. The lead Hieragen, his armor adorned with trophies from 100 hunts, approached the family. His eyes locked onto Aurora, who stared back without fear. "So," he rumbled, "this is the child who defies nature's boundaries." Before George or Cygnus could respond, Aurora stepped forward. "Nature doesn't have boundaries," she said, her voice clear and confident despite her young age. "It has possibilities." The Hieragen's eyes widened, then crinkled in what might have been a smile. He knelt down to Aurora's level, his massive frame dwarfing her small one. "Well said, young one. Perhaps you will show us some of these possibilities during our stay." As the delegation integrated into the colony's daily life, initial skepticism gave way to grudging respect and eventually genuine admiration. They watched Aurora navigate the complex social dynamics of the colony with ease, bridging cultural gaps with her unique perspective. By the time the Hieragen departed, they left not just with reports for their High Council, but with a new appreciation for the potential of interspecies cooperation. Their visit marked a turning point in Hieragen-human relations, opening up avenues for diplomacy that had once seemed impossible. 5 years after Aurora's birth, the colony had grown into a thriving metropolis. Recognized across the galaxy as a beacon of interspecies harmony, it drew diplomats, scientists, and dreamers from every corner of known space. George and Cygnus, now respected leaders in the galactic community, received an invitation that would have once seemed unthinkable. They were to address the Galactic Council with Aurora at their side. As their ship prepared for departure, George looked out over the colony that had grown from a fragile outpost to a shining example of unity. He felt Cygnus's hand on his shoulder and turned to see Aurora bouncing with excitement beside them. "Ready for our next adventure?" he asked, smiling at his family. Aurora grinned, her eyes sparkling with the same purpose he'd seen in Cygnus during the battle years ago. "Always," she replied, taking both their hands as they boarded the ship. As the colony receded from view, George couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and apprehension. They were about to step onto the galactic stage, carrying with them the hopes and dreams of countless beings. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together, as a family and as representatives of a future where the boundaries between species were just another frontier to explore.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.